The crack of a gunshot split the morning air, but Wade Morrison didn't flinch. He'd long since stopped fearing death, sometimes even welcomed the thought of it catching up to him finally. Sitting atop his chestnut stallion on the ridge overlooking Silverdale Valley, he watched the sun climb above the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the Arizona territory. It was 1878, and the West was growing tamer by the day everywhere except inside his own heart. Wade adjusted his worn leather hat, pushing it back slightly to wipe the sweat from his brow. 5 years had passed since he'd buried his son Thomas, just a boy of 8 when fever took him. 5 years of riding alone, taking bounties when he needed money, and avoiding towns whenever possible. He'd become a ghost in his own life, drifting across the frontier with only his horse Thunder for company. "Come on, boy," Wade muttered, patting Thunder's neck before turning away from the view. "Nothing for us here." The town of Silverdale lay just beyond the valley, but Wade had no intention of visiting. He had supplies enough for another week, and the bounty poster in his saddlebag would take him northwest, away from civilization. Just as he preferred it, the trail ahead wound through pine-covered hills. Wade rode at a steady pace, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain, a habit formed through years of tracking outlaws and avoiding those who might be tracking him. The warmth of the day settled around him, and the familiar rhythm of Thunder's hooves against the dirt became the only sound he needed. Until it wasn't. Wade reined Thunder to a stop, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver on his hip. In the distance, he heard it again, the unmistakable sound of gunfire followed by a woman's scream. For a moment, he considered turning away. Other people's troubles weren't his concern anymore. Not since Thomas. But something, perhaps the last remnant of the man he once was, made him click his tongue and urge Thunder forward, toward the commotion. As he crested a small hill, Wade saw them, 3 rough-looking men surrounding a stagecoach. The driver lay motionless on the ground, and a woman with auburn hair was being dragged from inside the vehicle. "This don't concern you, mister," one of the bandits called out when he spotted Wade approaching. "Ride on if you know what's good for you." Wade said nothing as he dismounted, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He'd faced down worse men than these men who killed for pleasure rather than profit. "I said ride on," the bandit repeated, raising his pistol. Wade drew and fired in one fluid motion. The bandit's gun dropped to the ground before he did, clutching his shoulder and howling in pain. "Next one goes through your head," Wade said, his voice low and even. "All of you back away from the lady and the coach." The 2 remaining robbers exchanged glances, weighing their options. One seemed ready to test Wade's resolve, but the other, evidently the smarter of the pair, raised his hands slowly. "We don't want no trouble," he said. "Just taking what we need to get by." "Get by somewhere else," Wade replied, his gun steady, "and take your friend with you." As the bandits retreated, helping their wounded companion onto his horse, Wade kept his weapon trained on them until they disappeared down the trail. Only then did he holster his revolver and approach the stagecoach. The woman stood beside it, her dress dusty but otherwise intact. She had retrieved a shotgun from somewhere inside the coach and was holding it with surprising confidence. "I appreciate your help," she said, lowering the weapon slightly but not entirely. "Though I might have managed on my own if you'd given me another minute." Wade raised an eyebrow. "Madam." "Abigail," she corrected. "Abigail Hayes, and you are Wade Morrison." He moved past her to check on the driver, finding the man unconscious but breathing. A nasty gash across his forehead explained his condition. "Your driver's alive," Wade said. "He'll need tending." Abigail nodded, setting aside the shotgun to kneel beside the injured man. "Mr. Jeffers has been driving this route for years. He has a wife in Silverdale." Wade watched as she tore a strip from her petticoat and used it to bandage the driver's head. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, suggesting this wasn't her first time dealing with injuries. "You're not just a passenger," Wade observed. Abigail glanced up at him, a hint of a smile crossing her face. I'm a doctor, or trying to be, heading to Silverdale to start a practice. Wade couldn't hide his surprise. A lady doctor? Yes, Mr. Morrison, a lady doctor. I trained in Boston. She finished tying the bandage. Now, since Mr. Jeffers is in no condition to drive and those men might return with friends, I could use your help getting to town. Wade looked down the trail towards Silverdale, then back the way he had come. The bounty could wait a day. I'll drive you in. Thank you, Abigail said, relief evident in her voice. I can pay you for your trouble. No need, Wade replied, already moving to check the horses' harness to the coach. They were nervous but unharmed. Together, they managed to get the unconscious driver into the coach. Wade climbed up to the driver's seat while Abigail insisted on riding beside him, the shotgun across her lap. In case they come back, she explained, settling her skirts around her. Wade nodded, impressed despite himself. He flicked the reins and the stage lurched forward toward Silverdale. As they drove, Wade found himself stealing glances at the woman beside him. She was perhaps 30, with intelligent green eyes and a determined set to her jaw. Her auburn hair had come partially loose from its pins, framing a face that was more handsome than pretty, marked by tiny lines around her eyes that suggested she smiled often. "You're not from around here," he said finally, breaking the silence between them. "Is it that obvious?" Abigail asked, a small laugh escaping her. "No, I'm from Massachusetts originally, came west after the war, worked in a field hospital in Kansas for a time, long way from Boston." "Yes, well, not many opportunities for female physicians back east. Out here, people are more concerned with whether you can stop the bleeding than what you look like doing it." Wade grunted in agreement. The frontier had its own way of judging a person's worth, usually by their usefulness rather than society's expectations. "What about you, Mr. Morrison?" Abigail asked. "You handle yourself like a man familiar with trouble." "Had my share," Wade replied, offering nothing more. To his relief, Abigail didn't press. Instead, she pointed ahead to where the town of Silverdale was coming into view. "Almost there. I expect Mr. Jeffers will need immediate attention." Wade guided the stage down the main street, drawing curious looks from townsfolk. He pulled up in front of what appeared to be the local doctor's office, where an older man with spectacles emerged onto the porch. "Dr. Wilkins," Abigail called out, "we've had trouble on the road. Mr. Jeffers is injured." The doctor hurried forward, and Wade helped him carry the driver inside. Abigail followed, already explaining the nature of the man's injuries. Wade stood awkwardly in the doorway, watching as the two medical professionals worked together, feeling suddenly out of place in this world of healing. "I should go," he said when Abigail glanced his way. "Wait," she replied, stepping away from the examination table. "At least let me thank you properly. Where are you staying in town?" "I'm not," Wade said. "Just passing through." Abigail studied him for a moment, her green eyes seeming to see more than he was comfortable with. "Well, Mr. Morrison, if you change your mind, I'll be staying at Mrs. Fincher's boarding house until my own place is ready. Perhaps you join me for supper. It's the least I can do." Wade hesitated, the invitation stirring something long dormant within him. "Perhaps," he said finally, knowing he wouldn't. Towns made him uneasy these days, and people even more so. With a nod to Abigail and the doctor, he stepped back out into the sunlight, whistled for Thunder, who had been trotting behind the stage, and mounted up. As he rode out of Silverdale, he tried to put the lady doctor from his thoughts. But that night, camped alone beneath the stars, Wade found himself remembering the determined set of Abigail Hayes's jaw, the confidence in her hands as she tended the wounded man, and the warmth in her eyes when she'd invited him to supper. "Fool," he muttered to himself, turning over to find a more comfortable position on his bedroll. In the morning, he would head northwest as planned, pursuing the bounty that would keep him in supplies for another month. Silverdale and its lady doctor would be forgotten. Yet 3 days later, Wade found himself back on the ridge overlooking the valley. The bounty had been collected with minimal trouble, a cattle rustler who surrendered rather than fight, and there was no logical reason for him to return to Silverdale. No reason except the memory of auburn hair and green eyes that wouldn't leave him be. Thunder seemed to sense his indecision, shifting restlessly beneath him. "All right," Wade said finally. "Just to check that the driver recovered, then we're moving on." The town was busier than before, with a cattle drive having stopped nearby. Wade left Thunder at the livery stable, instructing the boy there to give him a good rub-down and extra oats. Then, adjusting his hat low over his eyes, he made his way down the main street toward the doctor's office. He didn't make it that far. Halfway there, he spotted Abigail emerging from the general store, carrying a basket of supplies. She was dressed more practically today in a simple blue dress with her hair neatly pinned beneath a small hat. Wade considered turning away before she noticed him, but it was too late. "Mr. Morrison," she called, her face lighting up with genuine surprise and pleasure. "You came back." Wade touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Madam, just checking on the driver." "Mr. Jeffers is recovering well, thanks in part to your quick action," Abigail said, shifting her basket to her other arm. "He's home with his wife now." "Good," Wade replied, already feeling uncomfortable with the conversation and the curious glances from passers-by. He wasn't used to standing in the middle of a town street talking to a woman. Wasn't used to talking much at all anymore. "I'm just setting up my office," Abigail continued, seemingly oblivious to his discomfort. "Dr. Wilkins is retiring and I'm taking over his practice. Would you like to see it?" Wade found himself nodding, though he'd intended to decline. Something about Abigail Hayes made it difficult to walk away, despite every instinct telling him to do just that. Her office was at the end of the main street, a modest building with living quarters in the back. Inside, crates of medical supplies were stacked against one wall, and the examination room was partially organized. "It's not much yet," Abigail said, setting down her basket and removing her hat. "But it will serve the purpose. Most of my patients won't care about fancy furnishings anyway." Wade stood awkwardly near the door, hat in hands. "It's fine." Abigail turned to face him, her expression suddenly serious. "Mr. Morrison, may I ask you a direct question?" Wade tensed but nodded. "Why did you really come back to Silverdale?" The question hung between them. Wade looked down at his worn boots, then back at the woman who was waiting patiently for his answer. "I don't rightly know," he admitted finally. Abigail's expression softened. "Well, whatever the reason, I'm glad you did. I still owe you that supper if you're interested." Before Wade could respond, the office door burst open and a frantic man rushed in, his clothes covered in blood. "Doc," he cried, then stopped short at the sight of Abigail. "Where's Dr. Wilkins?" "I'm the doctor now," Abigail said firmly, already moving toward the man. "What's happened?" "It's my boy, mining accident, his legs crushed bad." "Where is he?" "At the mine, about a mile north. Couldn't move him." Abigail was already gathering supplies into a bag. "I'll need to go to him immediately." She glanced at Wade. "Mr. Morrison, if you're not otherwise engaged, I could use your help." Wade didn't hesitate this time. "I'll get the horses." Minutes later, they were riding hard toward the mine, Abigail seated behind the injured man's father on his horse, while Wade followed on Thunder. The mine came into view, a crude operation dug into a hillside where a few men were working to extract silver ore. The injured boy couldn't have been more than 16, lying pale and sweating on a makeshift stretcher, his right leg a mangled mess beneath a blood-soaked blanket. Abigail was off the horse before it fully stopped, rushing to the boy's side. Wade watched as she transformed before his eyes, her voice calm and authoritative as she assessed the damage and instructed the miners on how to help. "I need to operate now," she announced, looking up at the boy's father. "There's no time to move him to town." "You mean cut off his leg?" the man asked, his voice breaking. "No," Abigail replied firmly. "I mean save it, but I need clean water, more light, and strong hands to help me." Wade stepped forward. "Tell me what to do." For the next 2 hours, Wade assisted as Abigail worked to repair the boy's shattered leg. He held limbs steady, passed instruments, and kept curious miners back to maintain what cleanliness was possible in such conditions. Throughout it all, he marveled at Abigail's skill and determination. Her hands never wavered, even as sweat dampened her brow and blood covered her forearms. When it was finally done, the boy's leg splinted and bandaged, Abigail sat back on her heels and exhaled deeply. He'll need careful watching for infection, but with luck and proper care, he should walk again. The boy's father wept openly, clasping her hand in gratitude. The ride back to town was slower, with the injured boy carefully transported on a wagon that Wade helped prepare. Abigail rode beside the patient, checking his condition frequently. Wade followed on Thunder, watching her silhouette against the setting sun. By the time they reached Silverdale, night had fallen. The boy was settled in Abigail's clinic, his father at his bedside. Wade stood outside on the porch, waiting as Abigail gave final instructions for the night's care. When she finally emerged, she looked exhausted but satisfied. "Thank you for your help today," she said, leaning against the porch railing beside him. "You have steady hands. Ever consider medicine?" Wade shook his head. "I've caused more wounds than I've healed." "That was in the past," Abigail said softly. "Today you helped save a boy's leg, perhaps his life." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of the night settling around them. "I still owe you that supper," Abigail said finally, "though I fear I'm not fit company at present." Wade looked at her hair coming loose from its pins, blood still staining her cuffs, exhaustion evident in every line of her body, and thought she had never looked more beautiful. "I'm not much for restaurants," he said, "but I can cook a decent meal if you have supplies." Abigail's surprise gave way to a grateful smile. "There's a kitchen in the back. I haven't had time to stock it properly, but there are basics." Together they went inside. Wade built a fire in the small stove while Abigail washed away the day's blood and grime. In her small kitchen, he found flour, bacon, potatoes, and coffee, enough to make a simple but filling meal. When Abigail returned, her hair loosely braided and wearing a clean dress, Wade had bacon frying and biscuits in the oven. She watched him work with curious eyes. "Where did you learn to cook?" she asked, setting 2 plates on the small table. Wade turned the bacon in the pan. "On the trail." "Man gets tired of beans after a while." They ate at her small table, the lamplight casting a warm glow over them. At first, the conversation was stilted, but gradually, as the food disappeared and fatigue loosened their reserve, they began to talk more freely. Abigail told him about her struggles to be accepted in medical school, about losing her parents to influenza and deciding to come west where doctors were desperately needed. Wade found himself listening intently, drawn by her passion and determination. "What about you?" she asked eventually. "You're not just a drifter, there's more to your story." Wade stared into his coffee cup, the familiar weight of grief pressing down on him. He rarely spoke of Thomas to anyone, but something about this night, this woman, made the words come. "Had a wife once," he said quietly. "Elizabeth. She died giving birth to our son, Thomas. I raised him best I could while running a small ranch outside of Tucson." He paused, the pain still sharp after all these years. "Thomas was 8 when the fever took him. 5 years ago now, sold the ranch after, been riding alone ever since." Abigail's hand reached across the table to cover his. "I'm so sorry, Wade." It was the first time she had used his given name, and something about hearing it in her voice broke through a wall inside him. He looked up to meet her eyes and saw not pity but understanding. "Sometimes I think I see him," Wade admitted. "On the trail ahead, just around a bend, like if I ride fast enough I might catch up to him." "Grief does that," Abigail said softly. "It keeps our loved ones alive in strange ways." They sat in silence for a while, her hand still covering his, the touch of comfort Wade hadn't known he needed. "It's late," Abigail said finally. "You're welcome to stay. There's a spare room." Wade should have declined, should have returned to the livery for Thunder and ridden out of town that very night. But instead he nodded. "Thank you." The spare room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the back garden. Wade lay awake for hours, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house at night and thinking about the woman sleeping down the hall. Morning came with the smell of coffee. Wade found Abigail already dressed and checking on the miner's boy, who was awake and in good spirits despite his injury. She looked up when Wade entered, a smile warming her face. "Good morning," she said. "There's coffee in the kitchen and I managed to find some eggs." After breakfast, Wade knew he should leave. There was no reason to stay in Silverdale, and every reason to return to the solitary life he'd carved out for himself. Yet he found himself offering to fix Abigail's leaking roof and broken porch step instead. "I can pay someone to do that," she protested. "I need something to do with my hands," Wade replied, already assessing the repairs needed. One day stretched into 2, then 3. Wade repaired the roof, fixed the steps, and built shelves for Abigail's medical supplies. In the evenings, they shared meals and conversation, learning each other's stories one piece at a time. Wade discovered that Abigail snorted when she laughed too hard, that she hummed to herself when concentrating, that she cried over patients she couldn't save but never where they could see her. Abigail learned that Wade was well-read despite his rough exterior, that he could identify any bird by its call, that he still carried a small wooden horse his son had carved. On the 4th night, as they sat on the repaired porch watching the stars, Abigail turned to him. "What happens when you run out of things to fix, Wade?" The question cut to the heart of what Wade had been avoiding thinking about. He had no answer that made sense, even to himself. "I don't know," he admitted. "I should have moved on already. Why haven't you?" Wade looked at her then, really looked at her. The moonlight silvered her auburn hair and her green eyes held the reflection of stars. In that moment, he knew the answer but wasn't ready to speak it aloud. "Got used to a real bed, I suppose," he said instead, attempting humor. Abigail smiled, but her eyes held a trace of disappointment. "Well, you're welcome to it for as long as you like." The next day brought an unexpected visitor to Abigail's clinic. Sheriff James Dawson, a tall man with a weathered face and sharp eyes. He found Wade repainting the clinic's sign. "You'd be Wade Morrison," the sheriff said without preamble. Wade tensed, setting down his paintbrush. "I would. Heard you helped the doc with young Tim Carter's leg. Mining accident?" Did what she asked. The sheriff studied him for a long moment. "Also heard you're handy with a gun. Ran off those stage robbers single-handed." Wade said nothing, waiting for whatever was coming next. "Got a situation," Sheriff Dawson continued. "Gang of rustlers hit the Parkman spread last night. Took a dozen head of prime cattle and shot 2 ranch hands. I'm forming a posse." "I'm not interested," Wade said, picking up his paintbrush again. "Pays $10 when we bring them in. Still not interested." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Heard you were a bounty hunter." "I track bounties when I need money," Wade corrected. "I have enough at present." Just then, Abigail emerged from the clinic, wiping her hands on a towel. "Sheriff Dawson, is there something I can help you with?" The sheriff tipped his hat to her. "Just talking to your friend here about joining my posse, Doc. Those rustlers that hit the Parkman place could hit again." Abigail looked between the two men, her expression troubled. "I see." Wade could read the concern in her eyes, concern for the town, for the injured ranch hands, perhaps even for him. He sighed, setting down the paintbrush again. "When do you ride, Sheriff?" "First light tomorrow." "Meeting at the livery?" Wade nodded once. "I'll be there." After the sheriff left, Abigail stood beside Wade as he resumed painting. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "I know," Wade replied, "but it needs doing and I'm capable. Will you come back?" The question was asked casually, but Wade heard the real weight behind it. He turned to face her. "Do you want me to?" "Yes," Abigail said simply. "I do." That night their conversation over dinner was subdued. Wade cleaned his revolver at the table, the familiar routine calming his mind for what might come. Abigail packed medical supplies into a bag. "Just in case," she explained when he raised an eyebrow. "Promise me you'll be careful. Been doing this a long time," Wade assured her. "That's not a promise." Wade met her eyes across the table. "I promise." In the morning, he rose before dawn, dressing quietly in the dark. As he prepared to leave, he found Abigail waiting in the kitchen, a pot of coffee already brewing. "Thought you might want this before you go," she said, pouring him a cup. Wade accepted it gratefully, the warmth spreading through his hands. They stood in silence as he drank, the coming day stretching between them like a vast, unknown territory. When it was time to leave, Wade reached for his hat, but Abigail stopped him with a hand on his arm. Before he could react, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his, a brief, warm touch that ended almost before he registered it. "For luck," she whispered, stepping back. Wade stood frozen for a moment, the ghost of her kiss still on his lips. Then, wordlessly, he settled his hat on his head and walked out the door, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the danger ahead. The posse consisted of the sheriff and 6 other men, including Wade. They rode out as the sun crested the eastern hills, following the rustlers' trail north toward the mountains. Wade kept to himself, focusing on the signs in the dirt and grass that told the story of men moving fast with stolen cattle. By midday, it was clear the rustlers were heading for a pass through the mountains, likely to a hidden valley beyond where they could hold the cattle until it was safe to move them to market. The sheriff pushed the posse hard, hoping to catch them before they reached the pass. They made contact just before sundown, spotting the rustlers and the stolen cattle in a narrow canyon leading to the pass. The sheriff divided the men, sending 3 to circle around to cut off escape while the rest would approach from behind. Wade, assigned to the rear approach, moved into position with the others. But before they could spring their trap, a shot rang out. One of the posse members had been spotted. What followed was chaos. Gunfire erupted from both sides, the frightened cattle stampeding through the canyon. Wade took cover behind a boulder, returning fire only when he had a clear shot. One of the rustlers fell, then another. But the remaining 3 were dug in well, and the light was fading fast. The sheriff, crouched nearby, caught Wade's eye. "Need to flush them out before dark," he shouted over the gunfire. Wade nodded, assessing the situation. The rustlers were sheltered behind an outcropping of rocks about 50 yards ahead. Between their position and his was open ground, offering no cover. "Cover me," Wade said, checking his revolver. Before the sheriff could protest, Wade darted from behind the boulder, running in a zigzag pattern as bullets kicked up dirt around him. He reached a small depression in the ground and rolled into it, now only 30 yards from the rustlers. From this new position, he had a clear shot at one of the men. Wade took careful aim and fired. The rustler cried out, dropping his rifle. The remaining 2, seeing their position compromised, broke cover to run for their horses. The posse's gunfire cut them down before they made it 10 feet. As the echoes of the last shots faded, Wade stood cautiously. The canyon was suddenly silent except for the distant lowing of the scattered cattle. "Morrison," the sheriff called. "You hit." "No," Wade replied, walking toward the fallen rustlers to check for signs of life. All 3 were dead. The posse regrouped, counting their own losses, 1 man dead, another wounded in the shoulder. As the sheriff organized the recovery of the stolen cattle, Wade tended to the wounded man, applying pressure to stop the bleeding and using some of the medical supplies Abigail had packed. "You're good at that," the injured man said through gritted teeth. "Had a good teacher," Wade replied, tying off the bandage. It was near midnight when they returned to Silverdale, driving the recovered cattle before them and carrying their dead comrade's body draped over his horse. The town was mostly dark, but lights burned in the doctor's clinic. Abigail was waiting, her face drawn with worry that transformed into relief when she saw Wade riding unharmed. She hurried forward to help with the wounded man, ushering him inside for proper treatment. Wade stayed outside, helping the sheriff settle the recovered cattle in a corral behind the livery stable. By the time they finished, it was well past midnight. "You did good work today, Morrison," Sheriff Dawson said, counting out $10 from his pocket. "Town owes you." Wade accepted the money with a nod. Just doing what needed doing. As the sheriff walked away, Wade stood for a moment in the quiet street, fatigue settling into his bones. The events of the day played through his mind, the gunfire, the danger, the rush of adrenaline he knew too well. Yet somehow it felt different this time. For the first time in 5 years, he had been fighting for something, not just surviving until the next day. He made his way back to Abigail's clinic, finding her just finishing with the wounded posse member. The man's wife had arrived to take him home, leaving Abigail alone to clean up the examination room. She looked up when Wade entered, her face showing the same relief he'd seen earlier. "You're really all right." "I am," he confirmed, removing his hat. "How's Simmons?" "He'll keep the arm, though it'll be stiff for a while." Abigail set aside her towel and approached him, her eyes searching his face. "You look exhausted." Wade managed a small smile. "Been a long day." "Come," she said, taking his hand. "I saved you some supper." They sat at her kitchen table as they had so many nights before, but something had changed between them. The air seemed charged with unspoken words and possibilities neither was ready to voice. After they ate, Wade helped clear the dishes, then stood awkwardly in the middle of the kitchen. "I should let you get some sleep," he said finally. Abigail turned from the sink to face him. "Wade," she began, then hesitated. "Will you be leaving now? The rustlers are dealt with and you've fixed everything that needed fixing here." Wade really looked at her and saw the question behind her words. He thought about the trail ahead, the solitary days and lonely nights that had been his existence for 5 years. Then he thought about Abigail's smile, her determination, the way she'd kissed him that morning. "Not everything," he said quietly. Abigail's eyes widened slightly. "What still needs fixing?" Wade took a step toward her, then another. "Me," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion he'd kept buried too long. "I've been running for 5 years, thinking there was nothing left for me but memories and regrets. And now," Abigail asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "now I think maybe I was wrong." The distance between them vanished as Abigail moved into his arms. This time their kiss was not brief or hesitant but deep and searching, years of loneliness melting away in the warmth of their embrace. When they finally parted, Wade rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know how to do this anymore," he confessed. "How to be with someone." "We'll figure it out together," Abigail promised, her hands framing his face. Day by day. The next morning, Wade woke in Abigail's bed, sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, disorientation seized him. It had been so long since he'd awakened anywhere that felt like home. But then he heard Abigail moving about in the kitchen, and something settled inside him. He rose and dressed, then joined her for breakfast. They ate in comfortable silence, the events of the previous night creating a new understanding between them. After the meal, Wade knew it was time for a decision. "I need to check on Thunder," he said, rising from the table. Abigail's face showed a flicker of uncertainty. "Will you be coming back?" Wade reached across the table to take her hand. "I have something to show you first." "Will you ride with me today?" Curious. Abigail agreed. An hour later, they were both on horseback, Abigail on a mare borrowed from the livery, Wade on Thunder riding out of Silverdale toward the hills to the east. Wade led them along trails he'd ridden alone many times, until they reached a ridge overlooking a beautiful valley with a stream cutting through it. He dismounted, helping Abigail down from her horse. "What is this place?" she asked, gazing at the view. "Found it a few days ago while riding," Wade explained. "Reminded me of the land I had near Tucson." He walked a few steps forward, his eyes scanning the valley. "Good water, good grazing, close enough to town for a doctor to see patients, far enough for a man to breathe free." Abigail moved to stand beside him, realization dawning in her eyes. "Wade, are you saying—" "I'm saying I'm tired of riding alone," he interrupted gently. "Been thinking about putting down roots again, building something new." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "But I'd only want to do it if you might consider sharing it. Someday, when you're ready." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "I think I'd like that very much." Wade pulled her into his arms, his heart fuller than it had been in 5 long years. He knew there would be challenges ahead, ghosts to lay to rest, wounds still healing, 2 independent lives to blend together. But for the first time since he'd buried his son, the future looked like something to embrace rather than endure. 6 months later, a small cabin stood in the valley. Wade had built it with his own hands, with help from friends they'd made in Silverdale. Abigail maintained her practice in town, riding out to the cabin 3 nights a week. The other nights, Wade stayed in the rooms behind her clinic. Their arrangement raised eyebrows at first, but Silverdale needed its doctor, and after Wade helped organize the town's defense during a flash flood that spring, they had accepted him as well. On a warm autumn evening, they stood on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the valley in golds and purples. Abigail leaned against Wade's shoulder, his arm around her waist. "Sheriff offered me a deputy position today," Wade said. "Says the town's growing too fast for one lawman." Abigail looked up at him. "What did you tell him?" Said, "I'd think about it." Wade gazed out at the land they now shared. "Might be good to protect something instead of just hunting bounties." "I think you'd make a fine deputy," Abigail said, squeezing his hand. "And it would be nice to have you in town more often." Wade nodded thoughtfully. Then, reaching into his pocket, he withdrew a small box. "Got something to ask you first," he said, his voice suddenly nervous. Abigail's eyes widened as he opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small emerald that matched her eyes. "Abigail Hayes," Wade said, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears spilled down Abigail's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes, Wade Morrison, yes, I will." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Wade felt the last pieces of his broken heart mending. The trails ahead would no longer be ridden alone. From now on, she would ride beside him through whatever life brought their way. And somehow, he knew that Thomas would have approved.